Welcome back. This is the Chapter 4 presentation. I feel like haven't done this for a while, but last week was your week off, and this week I'm going to be doing Chapter 4, and I know I'm coming out with this a few days late, but I'm going to be doing Chapter 4, and then this is going to be related to the second quiz, okay? So all the questions related to the second quiz will be coming out of this chapter. And then the next thing that's going to be coming also in the next few days is the next digital assignment, okay, digital workshop. All right, let's get into it. I hope you're doing well, and yeah, let's talk some psych. I just included this slide because I thought it'd be interesting to show you my family, right? My wife and my 6-year-old Evelyn and my 1-year-old Charlotte, and I'll be talking about them quite a bit today. And part of it's because obviously, I know my own kids the best, but since we're talking about this infancy, I don't know. I'm sure you can understand how it would make sense to use my own kids as examples because that's my experience, right? And that I can actually hopefully use a couple stories to illustrate some points. And yeah, anyways, Charlotte, Evie, and Julie, my 3 girls. Okay, so I'll be talking a little bit about them today. Emotional development. Okay, so what I want to look at here is I want to make this point to you that I think that you'll find interesting, that there's sort of 2 types of emotions in a way. There's emotions that are me reacting to a situation, and then there's emotions that are me kind of thinking about things and feeling a certain way. Okay, so the idea is so say if I'm reacting to things, so the earliest emotions are those kind, like being surprised by things or interested in things, or oh, I feel joy or anger or sadness or fear or disgust. But then I want you to contrast that with things like, say, at the bottom there, in the first 6 months, we don't really see some of these bottom ones till almost a year. Something like embarrassment. So now the point I want to make is that those ones require a different level of thought, right? Because to be embarrassed, like a 3-month-old baby's not going to be embarrassed. To be embarrassed, they have to sort of be aware of themselves first of all, and then how they fit into the situation, and then how maybe what they did was like a violation of the scenario and therefore embarrassing, and then it almost demands an awareness of the other people that you're embarrassed in front of or whatever. But you just see that things like pride or shame or guilt or embarrassment or empathy or jealousy are all kind of thought based or conscious or self and other consciousness based. So the idea is that those come later, right? That the baby has these more reactive emotions first and basically immediately. We're going to talk about how all these develop and stuff, but emotions that infants express in the first 6 months of life include surprise, interest, joy, anger, sadness, fear, disgust. There's debate about when exactly these other emotions at the bottom appear: jealousy, empathy, embarrassment, pride. And obviously there's situational and I forgot I got a little bit different setup. I'm hoping that, and I've run a couple tests, so I hope I figured out how to get rid of that annoying glittery or not glittery, but glitchy green screen at the bottom. I'm using a different camera. These later developing emotions have been called self-conscious or other conscious, right? So, which is, yeah, because I guess empathy, it's weird to say because it's either self-conscious or other conscious. It's well, it's sort of both. It's self-conscious and other conscious kind of go together, right? And we're going to talk about that today too, that as the baby starts to understand that they're their own person, they start to understand that other people are their own person, and their ability to understand other people's emotions and their ability to understand themselves as a unique emotional, physical, cognitive person, although they could obviously not articulate that those 2 things go together, that the development of the self-awareness and self-concept of the child and their development of their understanding of other. So I'm just going to talk about the whole presentation on the first slide, but no, I'm just joking. Okay, most experts agree that these so-called self-conscious emotions don't occur until after the first year, a view that's increasingly being shared amongst developmental psychologists. Indeed, the structural immaturity of the infant brain makes it unlikely that emotions that require thought can be experienced in that first year, right? So that's maybe the clearest way to say it. Jealousy, empathy, embarrassment, pride, shame, guilt, those all require thought, right? So like they require a level of thought that this argument is that's not capable of like a 2-month-old. A 2-month-old can absolutely experience emotion, but they're not really having that, self-concept and concept of other isn't included. Interesting, eh? That the baby's basically born with and this is kind of a broad sweeps, but like a reactive set of emotions to deal with the immediate. And then as they learn about the immediate, they develop this like kind of, you could almost call it secondary skill set of emotional intelligence or whatever about reading situational factors. Right? Because jealousy, empathy, embarrassment, pride, shame, and guilt all would exist at a social level. Okay, emotion. So for our purposes here, and because there's obviously a lot of directions you could go in trying to define emotion, right? Like, there's a biochemical component to it. There's a way that emotion affects thoughts. Emotions are obviously cognitive, but then they also affect us at such a deep physical level. So for the purposes of this discussion, though, we're going to be looking at this idea that emotions are basically feeling or affect. So affect, like when you're sad, you have a sad affect. A feeling or affect that occurs when a person's in a state, so when they're in a mood kind of, or in an interaction, whether it's like with a person or with a situation that's important to them, especially if it's like related to your own well-being, right? So if you think of something like fear, like, yeah, a lot of things are scary, but things that are like directly threats to you are more scary. A lot of things are like make you happy, but things that are like directly related to you, it's like things that are, so that's like, I'm trying to explain that, especially to their well-being part. Almost all classifications of emotions are either negative or positive, right? So we think of, and this is kind of an interesting point. I don't even know why that's needed to be pointed out, except just that it's sort of interesting, right? Like we think of almost anyone you could say, whether it's like sad, we'd think of as negative, or like excited, positive, and then like panicked, you'd think negative, and then like, but maybe depends if you're in a crisis situation, maybe panicked is appropriate and a totally positive reaction or emotion, or not necessarily. But see how like the language it gets really difficult, because am I talking about like the biochemical like stress reaction, or am I talking about like the psychology of the experience of panic? So I find that like, and that's why I have like the brain picture on this slide, because this is such it's right, the emotional brain, and I think that picture is really interesting because it really highlights how appraisal, so like how you're making sense of the situation and how that affects the whole dynamic, right? Like, and you all know that like some people find certain situations stressful that other people don't, and how much you find it stressful or threatening or exciting or whatever. It's like that's based on your appraisal, your evaluation of the situation. The developing emotions of the infant are influenced by, basically, I say there, by the momentary and stable characteristics of the caregiver, right? Caregivers sometimes. So the idea is that like it's both who the parents are all the time, momentary, or which would be like stable, like the way that they always are. And then momentary is also like if there's extreme situations, right? Like sometimes moments influence and sometimes stable characteristics influence, which is just sort of a way of saying everything influences. And then during this first year, this baby's almost in this like dream mind where they're like very much imprinting their operating system of how they're going to make sense of the world. So like that's one of the reasons why they're so influenced by things, and it's one of the reasons why they're not remembering, because why we don't remember those years is because your mind's in this developmental phase. It's not having the type of thoughts that we have now that allow for that kind of memory storage is one aspect of it. Yeah, so this, and I kind of already made this point that self-conscious emotions seem not to occur until after the first year. Got one more point here. And that emotions are influenced by biology and experience, right? So that's kind of a point I've been touching on a bit in this rant, but this idea that part of emotions is the chemistry, and also like biology also includes obviously brain, the biology of the brain, and then experience, like situational factors, your life. All right. Okay, so for this, in this slide, I want to look at this idea of the origins of relationships, right? Like where does relationship, not of relationships, relationship, where does relationship come from, right? Where does the baby's idea, because one of the points I'm going to be making today is that the primary original relationship with mom becomes a blueprint in the child's mind of what relationship is, and that gets then imposed on future relationships. It's basically what Erikson means about whether you trust or not, or mistrust. It's not trust or not. That's an important misunderstanding some people make of Erikson, right? Like Erikson didn't think that you either developed trust or you didn't. He thought that you either developed trust or you developed a mistrust. Very different than not trust, right? Mistrust is like a cynical thing, right? Like it's not just a lack of trust. It's a lack of trust and actually a cynical mistrust. I don't mean cynical. What do I mean by cynical? Like just it becomes the fear or the idea in developmental psychology, and this is a very psychodynamic idea or psychoanalytic idea, psychodynamics, that like these why early childhood matters so much from a psychology perspective is because you're basically establishing the operating system, is language I like to use, but you're establishing the internal model is the word that people like Piaget or Freud would use, right? You're establishing the framework that like, who am I? How should people treat me? How should I treat other people? What am I valued? Do I value them? Can I trust them? That all these things are learned very deeply, right? Because this is the other thing is like, what does it mean to say that like a 6-month-old is learning to trust their mom or not? It's like, it's not a cognitive, there's aspects that are cognitive, but it's like a deeply cognitive you'd have to go like, it's cognitive bio and deeply psychological, like cognitive biopsych. You have to make some kind of like multi-triple word. So emotional linked interchanges. Emotion linked interchanges, right? So interactions between two people that are emotional based provide a foundation for the infant's attachment to the parent. So stable differences amongst family members, stable differences amongst families will affect the development of the emotion in the different children. Positive emotional exchanges are beneficial to development. Yeah, and these interactions between the parent and the infant, we're going to look at what this idea of reciprocal and synchronous, right? That like, is mom providing or is the caregiver providing what the infant's requiring, the newborn's requiring, right? And is like, does the infant need to be fed and mom keeps trying to soothe, or does the mom keep trying to feed when the baby needs to be soothed, right? Because with the baby, it's usually like needs to be changed, fed, or soothed, soother. It's interesting, even the language that and what soothing is, and that soothing and self-regulation are basically a similar idea. And then I'm going to talk about, yeah, this idea that crying is the most important mechanism that a newborn has for communicating with the world. It's like, I'm going to talk about Evie because Evie was an intense crier. But she was, and yeah, so I'll get to that story in a second. I'll wrap up this slide. So one interesting thing is that children, even children that are born completely blind, will still smile. And that's like quite interesting, right? Because it suggests that, well, like, why would a child that has never seen anyone else like smile? I don't know why I did it with like just smiled. Why would that be their response to being happy? So if a child, or let me say that in a more clear way, right? If the child's never seen someone else smile and they're smiling when they're happy, then smiling must be inherently associated with that positive emotional experience, right? And what we see with children that are born completely blind is that they will smile when they're happy, and they will smile often when they're dreaming. So there's sort of, we're going to talk today about this idea that there's sort of two types of smiling. There's social smiling, or smiling like when you're around other people, which blind children don't develop as obviously, right? Because they're not going to be able to see when other people are smiling. Yeah, children who are born blind and have never observed a smile or frown of another person will nonetheless smile and frown in the same way that children with normal vision do. And so this is kind of an argument for the biological aspect, right? Like, that has to be genetic then, right? Or it has to be, well, genetic and deeply like this, it gets into behavioral genetics, but and even like just muscular reaction, why a smile and a frown are a certain way. And there seems to also be a lot of similarity across culture. Like I say, there the cultural rules govern when and where and how emotions are expressed, but like that's basically what its culture influences, how it's expressed, not whether or not the emotions are present, right? Like obviously everybody has the ability to generate the emotion. It's just like I say here, like in the note section. Secondly, facial expressions of basic emotions such as things like happiness, surprise, anger, fear are very common across cultures. Right now, in some cultures, are people more like reserved or more expressive or more excited or more like exaggerated when they're talking and stuff, like obviously. But so it's not like necessarily universal in how it's expressed, but it's universal in how the toolkit's there for the ability to experience emotion. Okay, so that's kind of looking at the nature nurture aspect of where emotion comes from, right? Like how much of it is nature, aka biology, how much is nurture, aka culture, environment. So my current baby, like Charlotte, isn't that bad, and I should be careful saying this because I'm recording this part I'm getting this recording at least started. This is Sunday night about 11 o'clock. And she's sleeping right now. And she's not that intense of a crier in general. But Evie, back in the day, Evie was super intense, and so intense that like I actually spent like tons of time reading online about crying, like even way more than I ever had before, because like she would cry so loud that she would be crying and it was, for whatever reason, it was like not being able to get her back to sleep or whatever, and she'd be so upset and she'd be just like crying and like pulling away a bit and like crying so loud that just the volume would almost make me like have like almost like stress, like not that I was mad at her, but just that she was so loud. It was almost like it was completely volume related, to the point that like there was times honestly that I like would go and help her and I'd put on like the headphones that I would wear to like cut the grass, just because she was so loud. And it's like babies are so different that way. But it's interesting that like people develop an ability to, especially parents with their own kids, an ability to distinguish between types of cries. I have this up here for you. So like a basic cry has a more, this is just kind of the cry that's like when they're upset, maybe they're hungry. This kind of more rhythmic cry usually consists of a cry followed by a bit of silence, then a short whistle, somewhat higher than the pitch than the main cry. Just kind of this like, just a basic cry. You've all heard the whistle, meaning just like the in-breath. And then, but crying is the most important mechanism a newborn has for communicating with their world. Cries also provide information about the health of a newborn's central nervous system. A baby not crying would be a massive issue. Newborns tend to respond with cries and negative facial expressions when they hear other newborns cry. Now here's a kind of rough point. Although crying is universal, a study by Jones in 2012 revealed that newborns of depressed mothers showed less vocal distress when other infants cried, reflecting emotional and psychological dysregulation. So that a child that... See, the issue with depression, and this is a really important point for everyone to hear, is that why a mom being depressed affects the baby is because when a mom's depressed, they tend to interact less with the baby. That less interaction affects the baby. It's not, and this is an important distinction, right? Because the point is that what's negative for the baby isn't that mom's sad, it's that mom being sad decreases the amount of interaction. That decreased interaction is what is rough on the baby, and that's why it's really important to tell mothers that are maybe experiencing depression, which is super common, that they need to push themselves to interact with the child more than they feel like they need to. Okay. Yeah, most adults can determine whether an infant's cry signifies pain or anger. Yeah, I didn't even do the second two. So anger, like the mad cry, that's when Evie would be super loud. That's basically what I was talking about. Variation of the basic cry, but with more forced air through the vocal cords. It's like just screaming. It's another way to say that, right? Like, it's kind of funny to call it anger cry. But not, it's not funny. Like it is. It's just, I meant to say it's kind of funny to think of it as it's just more forced air. That all a yell is compared to just normal talking is an increased force of air. But it really is. It's all this developing vocal system, their first ability to create sound, and then also the pain cry. And it's like a lot of parents can notice that too. It's like there's a certain way that my kids would yell, especially Abby, the older one. If I heard her cry a certain way, I could tell, like, oh, Julie probably didn't let her have like an ice cream sandwich and she wanted one or something. And it's like, but then there's a way that she could cry where I'm like immediately stopping what I'm doing and just sprinting upstairs, right? the pain cry. A sudden loud initial cry followed by the holding of a breath. It's like that sometimes if I hear Evie cry and then there's like huge pause, it's like, yeah, there's no kind of build up, maybe stimulated by physical pain or a high intensity stimulus. Many developmental psychologists recommend parents should be soothing crying infants, not letting them cry it out, especially in the first year, right? Like the idea that's pretty heavy supported in especially developmental psychology literature, I think it's almost impossible to argue, is that within the first year, you should respond to the child's needs, right? It's like the child's not emotionally manipulating during that first year to the extent that you need to be like countering it. It's like that's probably creating attachment issues. It's like the child needs to be almost always it's fed, changed, comforted, soothed. And I know I'm telling you stuff you might obviously already know about that, but like, yeah, many developmental psychologists recommend a parent soothes a crying infant in the first full year. Consistent with Erickson's theory, responding positively to an infant's cry helps the infant to develop a sense of trust and a secure attachment to the caregiver. A mother's negative emotional reactions, such as like increased anger and anxiety to crying, can increase the risk of after attachment issues. So the idea is that like a lot of anger or anxiety shown to a fussy baby can hurt the baby's relationship to mom, right? Because what's a secure attachment? An attachment that is security, that is like a source of security for the baby, that the baby feels safe from mom, right? But if mom's mad every time the baby needs her, you can see the scenario there. Problems in the infant being soothable at 6 months of age have been linked to insecure attachments at 12 months of age, providing more evidence for this idea that early attachment patterns matter. So in other words, responding positively to an infant's cry teaches it that the world is a safe place and a place that it can trust. Okay, so this is a point I kind of already made, but I want to give you these definitions. So remember when I was making the point about the child that's born completely blind, and because there's obviously a massive range of visual impairment, but the reason I'm focusing on specifically a child born completely blind is because of the complete lack of, it's just really interesting from a nature-nurture perspective, because if there's zero visual stimulus that way, then it's like proof that the smile is coming from within, not from outside. And this is what we call a reflexive smile, right? And notice when you see the word reflexive, you see the word reflex, right? What's a reflex? A reflex is a behavior that you didn't learn. Well, what's a behavior that you didn't learn? Well, there's a whole bunch, right? It's like if I smack my hands really loud and kind of startle you, your eyes will blink. Or if someone blows air in your face, like your eyes will blink. It's like that's actually a reflex that everybody has. I think I already probably went over this, but like this idea that that's one that most reflexes fade within the first year, almost all of them, right? Like the tendency to like close your hand. We talked about some of this, but like it's kind of interesting that is about a smile too, right? There's like this reflex to smile when you're happy. And it's so interesting that like that maybe has been so important to human social life for so many thousands of generations or whatever, that it gets like imprinted at such a deep level that a child that's never even seen another human being smiles instinctively when they're happy. Almost brings you to like a chicken and the egg question, like what came first, smiling or happiness? Or is like smiling an inbuilt muscular reaction to positive emotion? Like, I don't know. I know I'm kind of weird with that description, but And then, yeah, social smile, this idea that social smiles start to occur in response to external stimulus, like other people's external stimulus, just like stimulus, just anything, right? Stimulus can be a sound, a sight, a person, whatever. So external meaning it's not just coming from inside, it's coming from outside. I see something funny, someone does something funny, dad's smiling, I'm smiling, right? This occurs as early as 2 months. And what's really interesting is as the baby's vision's improving, right? Because I'm going to say this a bunch of times in this course, but I find this interesting, right? That a baby's vision is basically adult level by 1. By 6 months, it's like 20/40. So it's like halfway to adult level. And as the baby's vision's getting better, that's one of the reasons they're starting to be able to notice things better and be more familiar and notice who's familiar and who's not. And this is one of the reasons why we're going to talk about how stranger anxiety starts to develop. Like part of that is that they can notice better who they've seen before or not. There's a visual, and obviously part of it's like memory and multi-dimensional, but there's a pure visual component to it too. Okay. So a child develops fear at around 6 months, and this is kind of a tough point too, is that in situations where children are in, well, really rough situations or abusive or neglectful situations, they can actually start to display fear that at 3 months that is usually not expressed until 6 months. And I'm sure you can kind of assume why, right? That because of exposure and the association and stuff like that. But the most frequent expression of fear when we're talking about kids is around this idea of stranger anxiety. And think about what that would mean, right? Just this idea of like somebody that's not somebody that I don't know making me nervous, right? Me in this is hypothetical being like the child, right? That by the time the child's about 6 months, which again, remember that last point I was making that their vision's now very improved. It's like halfway to adult vision. They can start to tell the difference between people. And they're starting to develop this kind of, well, it's like if I tried to like pass my baby Charlotte to my mom, she wouldn't cry. But if I tried to pass her to like a complete random person, like a really busy mall, she'd definitely mind, right? And part of the reason she's at, and this kind of like does max out a little bit after 1, but this idea is like, well, she knows who she knows now, and she knows who she doesn't know, and being with, and there's a difference in comfort level, right? After about 9 months, well, at about 9 months, stranger anxiety tends to be the most intense. It kind of escalates all the way until the infant's first birthday. Or sorry, at 9 months it starts to get more intense and kind of escalates all the way towards the first birthday. Yeah, it's interesting. It's my kids were different this way. And it makes sense, right? That from a biological perspective and from a evolutionary perspective, that staying close to your parents and a sense of danger when away from them would be like a characteristic of human babies. It makes complete sense. They're attached, their security, their whole sense of who they are. We're going to get to later today when we talk about attachment, but their whole sense of who they are is attached to mom. Like, it makes sense to be strained and stressed when mom isn't there and it's somebody that you don't know. Right now, on the next slide, I'm going to kind of get more specific here into stranger anxiety. So there's a bunch of like sub points I want to make here. Not infants. So some of these points are just the idea that like obviously not all infants are the same. So some show much more stranger anxiety and some show much less. There's individual differences, but then there's also, like I say, there's social context and characteristics of the stranger differences, right? So like, and that kind of makes sense, right? That means that, well, it matters if, are you meeting my daughter Charlotte like in my living room with her sister there and maybe her grandma there and me and her mom there, and that's a very safe environment to her. So that's a scenario where the social context is like, she's probably much less likely to show stranger anxiety towards you. But if, say, I have Charlotte with me and we're at a busy mall and it's like super busy and there's tons of people around and you run into her, you run into me there and I'm like introducing her to you and like I go like, here, you want to hold her for a bit? And it's like she's not going to be having that at all. It's like the situation is very different. That's kind of the social context. And then like how the person is, right? It's like if the person is being warm towards the child and like kind of speaking in a way that's like the baby interprets as safe, like it's going to be different between the people, right? So different between the context, right? Situation, setting, and then differences between the literal people that are the stranger, right? Because obviously, like, it could be different people. How similar are they? That's another interesting thing, is like my daughters never really showed a lot of stranger anxiety towards my brother, so their uncle. And some of it's because like we talk similar and act a lot of similar, so that familiarity is important. Yeah, that third point, that there's less stranger anxiety in familiar settings, like I've been mentioning, but also interesting studies have looked at this idea that like when, well, just being the difference between the child um, being on mom's lap or not. When the child's on mom's lap, they're much less likely to show stranger anxiety, and that makes sense if, especially in scenarios of secure attachment where mom is being used as like the base, the security base. Secure infants are still prone to stranger anxiety. Right, so even kids that have secure attachments to their mom, right, and they have this like relationship of trust, they're still going to be showing this stranger anxiety, right? So, and that kind of makes sense. Is like their trust isn't generalized yet; it's still specific to mom. And since their trust is specific to mom, there's at this point still a distrust towards others, right? Who the stranger is and their behavior influences the anxiety of the infants. And it's interesting also to note that infants are there's less stranger anxiety towards other kids. It tends to be towards other adults, and that sort of makes sense because who are these big people, right? In this child, in the developing child's mind. So kids also learn from their environment, right? And social referencing is this idea of like, say Charlotte does something that she thinks is funny. She's getting to this age now, because she turned 1 in late July. So she's getting somewhat close to a year and a half, and she does this social referencing for sure of like, she does something and then like looks to me to see if I laugh, and if I laugh then she finds it funny. So notice how there she's like using my emotional reaction as information as to how she should feel, right? So if I don't find it funny, maybe it's not funny. But so, and this is like the same idea of when like a kid falls down, you don't want to have like a super panicked reaction, because then your reaction like social references on them, and it can influence their reaction, right? So social referencing is this idea of reading the emotional cues in others to determine how to act, and that the kids doing that, it's actually a big sign of their developing mind, that they're actually being like, oh, I think this is funny, dad thinks this is funny, this must be funny. And it's why it's like they're developing intelligence, is because it's showing this inclusion of another person's, well, this reading of the environment. As you, and yeah, so social referencing, soothing, this other point here, that soothing helps infants start to modulate or control their own emotions and reduce their levels of stress hormones. That infants are affected by things like their fatigue, how tired they are, how hungry they are at the time of day, who's around them. Right? Kids are actually under a lot of stress in the sense of not necessarily stress, but under a lot of pressure with their developing minds of trying to read the situation, right? And that when they're soothed, one of the things that like a soother and one of the things that like rocking a baby and stuff like that does is help them kind of calm down that emotional aspect, reduce literally their stress hormones. It's like you're almost having to relax them for them. Like you're almost having to relax them, right? And that's just another way of saying soothing. And infants' emotions are heavily influenced by, and like that's like obvious to any parent, right? Like obviously when your kid isn't sleeping well and is hungry, their emotions are much less under control. And that infants are like, one of the things they're doing is starting to learn like emotional regulation, how to control it. So in this next part, I'm going to talk about personality, and I wanted to just start you off. You notice the scene change. So this is now Monday. I want to talk about personality and this idea that there's different styles of people, right? And what does that mean? What does it mean to say that you don't like somebody's personality or you're attracted to someone's personality, their style of being, their style of responding emotionally to situations, their style of behavior, their style of treating people, their person's style, their personality. Okay, so sorry, I just noticed that this glass thing was making a crazy glittery reaction. So hopefully that's better. Okay, so I want to make this point that a child's not really born with personality. You wouldn't really say that kids have different personalities. What you would say is that kids are built with, or born with differences in temperament. And then that temperament interacts with the parenting situation. Temperaments like the nature, the parenting environments like the nurture, and personality is almost the result, what those create. Right, so personality is like a word we would use to talk about like older kids and obviously adults. And it's kind of this idea of saying you're not just like a completely random person, even though you might respond differently in different situations due to different situational factors. There's like a you that goes between those situations. You have a certain pattern of responding to stress or excitement or surprise. And some of those patterns are behavioral, some of them are emotional. And where does that come from? Well, that comes from the fact that, and because this is trying to answer a larger question of why isn't everyone just the same, right? Why isn't everyone's personality the exact same? Why aren't brothers or sisters' personality the exact same? Right? Because in those scenarios, the genetics are very close, the parenting upbringing is very close, and you see sometimes very different personalities. Okay, so I'm going to make the argument that it's related to this topic of temperament. Okay, so temperament. And I want to kind of build this, argument that kids are built with different temperaments and then also born into different environments. And that's a kind of more specific way of talking about this kind of nature and nurture of child development. And that this is the beginning of the conversation about personality. But at this point, we're not calling it personality yet. We're calling it temperament. Personality comes down the road, age-wise. So Chess and Thompson and Thomas, if you could have this down, please. These are kind of classic ways that people talk about this, right? That like some kids are easier, some kids are more difficult. You can see how like some kids are more slow to warm up to adults. You can see how this is sort of from like a parenting perspective, right? And it actually makes total sense. Like I've even said comments like this in the class that like my daughter Charlotte in some ways is just easier. Evie is amazing. She's so emotionally deep and she's so like such an awesome kid. Charlotte just like goes to bed easier, is like just less loud as a crier. She just has like, that generally positive mood, quickly establishes routines, adapts easier. Notice this isn't about like, is it a good or a bad kid? It's like how a lot of it is around self-regulation and adaptability. More difficult children, again, this is like this Chess and Thomas classification, react more negatively, right? And there's obviously this difference, right? There's differences if you're just going to say like, not all babies are the same. It's like, yeah, okay, obviously, but what do you mean by that? Well, they respond differently to different things. Some get agitated easier, some cry more intensely, some cry more often, right? So there's always those variables of behavior like intensity, duration, and frequency. And then like some adapt to routines. So that would be things like sleeping primarily at that age and feeding. Then eventually things around going to the washroom. So the difference between easy and difficult sort of, I'm sure you get. And then the idea of slow to warm is this idea of just kind of exactly what it sounds like, that some kids behave a lot like an easy child once they kind of get going, that they might have a lower initial activity level or somewhat negative or lower intensity mood, but that, just as the name suggests, that they will display behaviors very similar to the easy child. And now notice how this is kind of like somewhat simplistic, but also informative. Like you can definitely look at kids and classify them in this way, and this really is like even a parent that has more than one kid could compare how much like they're different kids on this. But you can see there's like limitations to this, obviously, right? Like it's not like super rigorous, although Chess and Thomas took this very seriously and we're actually like observing, and there's behavioral kind of index scaling, right? So you'd have, I'm not sure how they specifically did it, but I'm assuming that they would be taking like inventory of displayed behaviors and showing that like, these kids, think what the difference between these styles of, because when you really say like, what is it? What do you mean that these kids are different? What's easy or difficult? It's really like different style of emotion and behavior that seems to be right at the beginning, right? Which sort of goes against, which is interesting, right? Because it speaks to uniqueness. It speaks to this idea that not every baby is the exact same. Okay, so if we're going to look at this then and say, so making this broader argument that attachment, times or plus whatever parenting equals personality down the road, right? That personality is basically collaborative creation of this interaction between nature and nurture, temperament and environment. So now if we were to say, okay, so how do you actually measure temperament as people interested in developmental psych? I would say, well, okay, so you could actually theoretically make a scale. So I'll explain this as if we're making a scale, right? And we could say like, okay, well, some kids are more active than others. And you could say if you had 100 kids playing in the backyard, and you say we're doing this obviously like in a way that's never going to like embarrass them or anything. We're just like, this obviously a made up hypothetical. You're like, okay, one kid's the running around the most and one kid's the least active, and we could put the least active kid as a 1 and the most active kid as 100, and you could theoretically in this made up scenario give every kid a score, right? How active are they? And the reason I went so far with that example is to make this point that you could score each of these things, right? So I'm basically saying that this is a 5-factor scale similar to Big Five, which is a measure of adult personality that we're going to talk about later. Okay, so the first one is activity level, like I was mentioning, the idea of like how much this tendency to move often and vigorously rather than to remain more passive. And that's probably the easiest one to understand, right? Obviously, like 2 kids, one could be way more active than the other one. Now the next one, approach. Approach is kind of the older language. Now you see it a lot as positive emotionality, and emotionality just like expression of emotion. This tendency to move towards things. That's why the approach word actually makes sense, because it's like, well, there's a new toy. Does the baby feel, it's almost the opposite of shyness, the tendency to move towards approach rather than to pull back from a new experience, right? And to be like, ooh, like my daughter now, Charlotte, always does that. Her face makes this ooh kind of look. I saw myself do that in the camera, though I won't do that too many times. That probably looks silly, but just this idea of like she gets like shows this like excited look. Okay, so now back to the scale. So now we're making the scale. So now we have two columns, right? So you could take the kid that is the most like outgoing that way and approaching new things, and then the kid that's the least, and you could put them on the 1 to 100, right? And then everyone else would land in the middle, which is sort of how you make, well, it's not exactly how you make scales, but let's not overcomplicate this. This example's, I think, working so far. Okay, yeah, because when you're making scales, you have to establish the average, right? What the average is, and then what deviation from the average is. So we're kind of doing it different, but that's because this is a hypothetical. Okay, that's all extra. If you didn't follow it, that doesn't need to be in your notes. That's just me rambling. So the third one, okay, so we have two. We have activity level, we have positive emotionality. Number 3, inhibition. So this is sort of, it says the flip side of approach, the opposite. This is the tendency to show inhibition, or like hesitation would be another word you could use. But inhibited's a good word because it means like something that's stopping you, inhibiting you. Something internal, and like shyness or nervousness or whatever words you want to use. The flip side of approach, and the tendency to respond with fear or withdraw in a new situation. Withdrawal, like pulling back. And it seems that kids that score high in inhibition tend to also later in life score high in shyness. Number 4, negative emotionality. The tendency to, so that's the third column. The fourth column, negative emotionality. You can kind of understand what that would be, right? Just this idea that obviously if you have a whole bunch of kids, some of the kids are more fussy, some get irritated easier, some, and on those same dimensions as before, like not only do some kids get upset easier, some kids get upset for longer and more often and more intensely. It's frequency, duration, intensity. Research always comes back to those 3 things when you're measuring behavior. Yeah, so negative emotionality, the tendency to respond with anger, fussiness, loudness, irritability, a low threshold for frustration. That just means like getting upset easy. So I'm hoping this makes sense, right? That like obviously if you have a whole bunch of babies and there's something like some annoying sound in the room and it makes a few of them cry and not others, then obviously there's a different amount of stimulus needed. Not, they don't all respond the exact same to the annoying stimulus or whatever example I just made up, right? There's differences. There's temperamental differences between kids. And then number 5, that the 5th column we would score, and this is another one out of 100, basically like how much can they pay attention? How much can they be doing a task and stay committed and persistent on that task, stay doing it? How much can they effortfully control what they're doing? The ability to stay focused, manage attention and effort. Right, this is something where like my daughter Evelyn was awesome at. My oldest, ever since she was little, she would like play these elaborate games, and when a kid's playing in that like imagination world with dolls and with all this kind of stuff, it's like it's amazing cognitive development happening in that moment of like free play, right? So kids are very different in their ability to basically stay focused on things. And you can see how kids that score high in that, how that could be related to like success in school later, just because paying attention, anybody, you could take 2 people that have lower IQ can outperform people with higher IQ if they can pay attention better. And if you think about why, it's because attention is basically the focusing of your mental toolkit. And so the more you can focus it, the more you can use your IQ. And so if you learn to really work on your discipline and attention and focus, then you're putting your mind in a position to perform at its highest potential level, right? So, yeah, I don't know why I just all of a sudden started talking about attention, but I guess it's completely relevant. But there's a visual aspect of attention. There's a aspect of attention that's not just focusing, but suppressing distracting thoughts. And this is going to be one of the points that we make. It's like, is a 5-year-old really that much? Is really that much a gap of, and this is just hypothetical, in intelligence between a 5-year-old and a 7-year-old? Or is one of the reasons why a 7-year-old would do like way better on a test than a 5-year-old that the 7-year-old can pay way better attention? Is that executive control and that ability to pay attention increases? So my point is like, maybe we assume it's like it's just that the older kid's smarter. And my point is maybe it's that the older kid is paying attention better on average. Okay. So if you look at this origins, right? Origins, where does it come from? Where does temperament come from? And then stability, meaning like, is it a score that we should actually care about, right? And you've heard me mention this a few times, maybe, that if I was to do a personality test on you and then did it again in a few weeks and in a few years, and all the tests gave completely different answers and they didn't really tell you anything meaningful about your life, you could rightfully say that that test was meaningless in that scenario. So the fact that these early temperament scores actually have a predictive effect on behavioral and kind of personality level characteristics in an individual later speak to the fact that you're actually measuring something real. And that's where I kind of mean with that idea of, okay, so where does temperament come from? And the first point is that there's an aspect of it that's genetic, that's coming through our heredity, right? And we can see that, where I say that personality studies support innate temperament, it seems that there is a big connection between temperament scores at 1 and personality scores in the early 20s, right? That there actually is, for example, kids that score super high on inhibition have a greater likelihood to be shy as older kids and have a bigger chance of having things like dealing with things like social anxiety, which are big issues now, right? So these ideas of like early temperament, and some of that should sort of make sense, right? That like being shy early is somehow linked to being shyer later. And I know social anxiety is not just being shy. I'm not trying to make a point like that. But that whole point I was trying to make is around the word stability, that this early measurement has something to say about later, which is a sort of fundamental claim of psychology, that the early experience has this fundamental path-altering shape that can, you know, in a lot of scenarios when there's things that go wrong, that's a lot of the reasons for things like psychotherapy is to address when things have gone wrong and to help people heal. But okay, so the second point around heredity is this idea that identical twins are more alike in temperament than fraternal twins. So when you have twins that are from the same egg, so their genetics are closer than twins from different eggs, that we see that their temperament is closer, which is just another kind of argument for this side of nature, that there seems to be like a genetic part, right? The two eggs that are a split of the same seem to be similar, and then the ones that are different are more different. So maybe being, right, so it's just the reason why identical twins are so interesting from a research perspective is it's the most you can possibly control the nature variable in a nature and nurture debate. And so then yes, and then you're comparing it to other twins who are also from the same mother, but the genetics is a little bit, well, it's a unique mix of mom and dad. Or it's just a different egg. I'm confusing the example, but anyways, identical twins more likely tend to be more alike than fraternal twins. I think I've already in this course brought up the Minnesota twin studies, but that's like a really interesting, that's probably the biggest huge long-term study on identical twins if you're interested in that. And then a lot of Kanga's research on brain activity, neurological processes, so that part of the differences in temperament is like kind of relating to what's going on inside the brain, that kids have different thresholds for arousal, right? Some kids get stressed out easier, or Some kids have more resiliency to being stressed out, that it seems to affect things like dopamine and serotonin, right? That shyness can even be related to differences in frontal lobe symmetry. So there's an aspect of it that's brain. So basically what I'm going to say here is like, okay, where's temperament come from? Some of it's from the genetic inheritance from our parents, heredity. Some of it's from what's actually kind of going on in the brain of the child, right? And that sort of makes sense, right? Why is the child acting and why is the child the way that they are temperament wise, right? Activity, positive approach, negative emotionality, inhibition, and attention. Well, some of it is what they inherited from their parents. Some of it is what's sort of going on in their mind and what they're responding to and all that, like they're all these neurological processes. And then you can see then the next part, and then some of it's the environment. Right, and then as people, well, this idea of Sandra Scar, I mean, is interesting. This idea of niche picking, right? Niche meaning like finding your own role, and this idea that people seek out situations that are a match to their temperament. So a shy child will maybe seek out activities where they don't have to be overly social, whereas a less shy child might seek out more situations that are social, and then does seeking out those social situations build the child's ability to do that, does that, so kind of what comes first, the temperament or the neurological activity? It's like a chicken and the egg thing. Like people, it gets into this interesting thing of like, well, why does a person stay shy? Part of it is because as someone becomes shy, they'll be less likely to seek out situations where maybe they feel vulnerable socially, which makes complete sense. And then that can reinforce the shyness, just like the opposite can reinforce the social skill development in certain ways, right? Obviously. But yeah, she did this interesting research looking at how people of all ages choose experiences that reflect their temperament, and then that plays an influence too, right? It's not just that people are different, it's that people are different and then they seek out different situations based on being different, and then those different situations play a developmental role. Right, and I say there that parents may be able to either increase or decrease the effects of an inborn's temperament tendencies. Right, like you can absolutely work with kids to help build things like attention span, like especially kids that are dealing with things like attention issues, like ADD and ADHD. I don't know, I think one of the best things you can do with kids in those scenarios is have them in structured extracurricular activities, like things like traditional martial arts, or maybe like drama clubs or art clubs, or things where they're able to process some of the well, actually, my biggest suggestion from a personal level, if anyone is interested, is definitely like traditional martial arts, because I think, especially for young kids, because I think it's it's got a proven track record of helping improve things like concentration and discipline. And that's so important, because then all of a sudden the kid will be able to perform much better because they'll actually be able to use their IQ. There's the random martial arts shout out for today. I won't keep doing that. But I just, that if you've like, I've probably already talked about it a bit, but that's like one of my interest areas, right? And I really do think that like the reason why I think that is just because there's that kind of culture of like respect and paying attention and discipline, and that's actually really good as a way to build the ability to pay attention and focus and have joint attention. And then once that cognitive skill set is increased, it starts to butterfly effect through the whole realm of cognitive performance. Okay, so I just have 2 points on this slide for you that kind of just say like another thing to add to this conversation around the origins, like where temperament comes from and how much is it actually a measurement of something that is predictive of later in life stability. Right, is it a stable measurement? Is it actually measuring something that's a consistent difference between people? And so what we see is that a lot of the actual research behind these points I'm making is coming from your textbook, right? Like you're going to be able to find, if you wanted to see like, well, how do we know this? It's like I'm kind of making summary points a lot of the time, right? But a lot of these temperamental patterns that we see in infancy, so the differences we see between infants, I don't know why it took so long to think of the word, right? The differences we see between babies tends to be reflective of differences that we're going to see later, right? Which, again, to make the point is that actually is okay. That's good because that means that we're actually maybe measuring a real thing that's really influenced or linked to something else. And researchers have found considerable consistency at different ages and measurements of things like inhibition, right? There does seem to be a link between infants that score really high in inhibition and things like shyness in youth and adolescence. So there does seem to be that difference in, people being shy, it's not just like how they were raised or whatever, even though that could be a huge part of it. There seems to be a physical component of it too, and maybe even a neurological component, and maybe even a biochemical component, and maybe even right, all these kind of layers to it. It's like people are complicated, and they're complicated right from the beginning. And even though we're saying this is like this 5-factor model, what that really means is there's all these other variables that you could measure too, but when you kind of get down to the core of it, to make sure, because that's how you make like a scale, right? You have to see, like, make sure that you're actually measuring something and you're not accidentally measuring something else, and you're not measuring like how happy people are and how joyful they are, and that's actually like the same thing. And so a 5-factor means you basically narrow it down to really there's 5 main things. And if we know people score on these 5 things, right? So to give the adult example, it'd be like extroversion, introversion, openness to experience, agreeableness or disagreeableness, emotional stability or neuroticism, and then conscientiousness. It's like if I know your score on those 5 things, then there's a lot of things I can understand about like your potential to deal with certain kinds of emotional and behavioral situations. But we'll talk about Big 5 way later. Okay, so now that's talking about adult level. We're still at the development of this. Okay, so this the inhibition to the unfamiliar, right? So think about this. It's like unfamiliar means something you're not familiar with, right? So something that's new or something that's unique, a new stimulus in your environment. And how nervous are you, or how much are you inhibited? How much inhibition do you feel towards that unfamiliar? Right? How much do you react to aspects of unfamiliarity with avoidance, distress, or a subdued, like a withdrawn, dampened emotional response? Right? And that some kids score higher and lower at that, and it starts to become apparent around 7 to 9 months. And the reason is because, well, not being overwhelmed by something like, say, for example, me being excited to me dealing with the stress associated, or like the nervousness or the inhibition associated with doing something new. It's weird giving the example because I'm trying to give the example as if I'm a 1-year-old, but me trying to like deal with the nervousness of crawling over to get the toy, it's like that actually takes some mental control to deal with that hesitation, to actually control my kind of emotions enough so that I'm like calm enough to actually just, well, not be inhibited by that emotion. And the idea is that actually takes effortful control, self-regulation, to get yourself back to regular, right? If this is regular and then all of a sudden you're upset, can you like get yourself back to regular? Can you self-regulate? That self-regulation is an important aspect of temperament, right? How much they can control their kind of emotions, right? How much they can discipline. And so, and this is kind of related. It's not one of the 5 elements, but it's definitely deeply related to this temperament thing, and it's almost like an additional dimension. And this idea that like sometimes kids are really high in effortful control, and they're actually really good at like not letting their emotions overwhelm them, and they're pretty good at self-soothing. or calming. And then some kids aren't as good at that, right? They would score in lower in effortful control, like they're lower at being able to calm themselves down, soothe themselves, like a soother for a baby, right? That actually mimics eating, right? So I think I might have already said this in this presentation, but just the language is interesting. Right, but I just wanted to make that point too, that children shouldn't be like kind of pigeonholed or like thought, okay, this is what they are, and then they're defined as this. It's like if humans are anything, they're able to break cycles and change patterns, right? But there is something to be learned about the connection between early life and these kind of early displays of emotion and behavior and what they have to say about what's potentially coming down the road. So inhibited temperament. Okay, so this is the idea that when the child's feeling that inhibition, right? And I kind of was trying to bounce around with the words I was using, but I was trying not to use words like feeling nervous or feeling embarrassed or all these words that sort of demand more thought that the child at that age isn't going to be having. Those are more like words that are going to be kind of like how we started this presentation, saying that there's a certain amount of thought that the child's not at yet. They're not really experiencing emotions that are thought-based. They're experiencing more emotions that are reactive, and that this sense of feeling inhibited has a very biological component. It's not cognitive. It's not like language-based, like, oh, I shouldn't do this. It's like a felt hold back, a felt inhibition, right? It's like if you're trying to drive the car but the brake's on, that's maybe a good example of you're inhibiting driving forward by having one foot on the brake. And that inhibited temperament meaning style of behavior and emotion, kind of is associated with this specific or unique physiological, so like physical pattern of like a fast heart rate for a long time, high levels of cortisol or stress in the blood, right? A lot of activity in the frontal lobe of the brain, the right frontal lobe, the part that's associated a lot with like kind of trying to figure out well, I could just leave it at that. It's the part of the brain that's trying to figure out what's going on, right? And if you can think about it as like a couple-month-old baby looking at a new situation that they're nervous about, it makes sense that there's a part of their brain that's firing, that's trying to figure out what's going on. Studies suggest that heredity has a moderate influences on differences between kids, right? So heredity has at least some effect on this. Kids can learn to be less fearful, have less inhibition, right? So that's just, those 2 points are basically just saying some of it's nature, some of it's nurture. There seems to be evidence for both, like a lot of these things. It's like a complex mixture, right? Almost always of nature and nurture. There's a part of me, yes, I'm going to freestyle this. It's like, what am I going to say here? Because I wanted to find the self, and I was like, okay, so the self is this weird thing where you almost have to define it by saying what it's not. It's like, what is myself? Well, it's not, and this is called apathetic knowledge, or in philosophy it's called negation. Figuring out what something is by figuring out what it's not. I'm not just my thoughts. I'm not just my memories. I'm not just my emotions. I'm not just my identity. I'm not just the part of my identity that's my lived, or that's my kind of stored sense of who I am, both myself and with other people. That there's a part of me that has an identity. What does that even mean? Right? There's like a self. And this question's been like the deepest question in psychology since the beginning, right? This is where Carl Jung really went deep into this idea that self is different than identity, and yourself basically has an identity, and that the idea that you have about yourself isn't the true self, it's the idea that you have about yourself, literally. and that a lot of our healing lies in getting as close as we can to the true self, or people have said that in different ways. But I'm trying to make this point of like, oh, like one way of saying it is myself is the part of me that thinks that's Mike, right? That's Mike. That's not Mike's thoughts or Mike's emotions or Mike's memory. And then you could say, well, isn't that your identity? And it's like, okay, well then myself's the part of me that calls itself Mike. See how we're in this just like kind of deep end philosophy kind of talk, but it's kind of interesting that the child starts to get to this ability of realizing they're their own person, that they have, and you start to see, well, something really interesting happens as soon as a child starts to develop. Like on the next slide, we're going to talk about a word, self-concept. Once we start, they have to start to develop a concept that they're their own person that's moving through space and time and having emotions and having thoughts, and they have their own film in their head, their own movie of their life or whatever. It's different than other people. Then they start to realize, well, okay, well then you do too. And so you see that as the child's understanding of self improves, their understanding of others improves. Okay, so self. Okay. I could maybe redo this slide, but I think you get the point. So in this presentation, and as we keep moving through the lifespan, I'm going to be talking about this idea that how the child or the emerging human's understanding of who they are is expanding and getting more and more complex and adding more and more layers. And before that can happen, they first need to get to this point of understanding they're their own separate self. And as somebody that's an adult listening to this, it's going to be a bit of a challenge to think about this idea that there was maybe a time when, again, this is hard to talk about because it's not like a 1-year-old or a child that's like 10 months old could like, they obviously don't have the spoken ability to explain that they've developed this concept. So one of the ways we see it is in certain ways that they behave to their environment. Right? It's not like a child's going to realize, oh, now I've kind of reached this level of understanding that I'm my own person. And it's like, no, but the way they interact with the world kind of shows that they've reached this level. They understand a little bit more about what's going on. Things aren't as random. They're starting to notice patterns to things. Right? There's this infant's developing this awareness that he or she's their own separate person going through this time and space, right? Going through life. And that they can act on their environment and they can do things and make sounds and they can do things and people will respond. And this is all like in this like towards the end of the first year of life. Right? Babies are usually fully aware of their subjective self by the time they're getting to that like, last quarter or whatever of the first year, from 8 to 12 months. Just like object permanence. And if you want to just kind of, in your notes, just kind of write that word. The next slide, I'll explain what that is. Okay, so in this first year of life, the child's developing subjective, right? There's like objects, and then there's the subject that observes the objects. It's like that we're all watching this video, but some of you are maybe finding it boring. Some of you are finding it super interesting. You're having different subjective experiences, right? So the child's starting to realize that they have their own kind of world within their mind, and that this is going to be paired pretty quick over the next few years with this growing understanding of, well, so does everybody else, and that's coming down the road, right? The child doesn't have that understanding quite yet. They're starting to develop their own first, their own subjective understanding. So a lot of you have probably played peekaboo with a baby, right? And my daughter right now, I should film it, but add it in. But she's fun to play peekaboo with now. She'll like hold up a blanket, and then she'll do it now to me because she's getting like a little bit old for it, because now she understands it's just a game. Whereas at first it would like really honestly surprise her. And then she starts to realize, well, Daddy's not like disappearing and breaking in and out of from in behind the matrix. It's like he's just like doing a trick. They start to realize that actually, just because she can't see me for a second, I'm still there. That I'm just because in between I haven't done a video for you in a little bit doesn't mean like this bookshelves went anywhere. It's like, and you know that obviously, you're like, yeah, obviously objects are permanent. Obviously objects are permanent. But the baby's starting to realize, like, okay, this world has patterns to it and there's a consistency to it. And actually the child's starting to reach this level of object permanence, or basically, which is kind of noticeable once peekaboo doesn't work anymore. Because at a certain point, the kid is just going to like pull your hands down because they're not falling for the trick anymore. They know that you're just playing a trick. You're a permanent thing. And the idea is that that's like reaching a certain cognitive milestone. Right? And Piaget later is going to say like this is one of the things that's kind of definitionally considered like one of the things that ends the sensory motor stage, that first stage, is this displaying of object permanence, this understanding that like, because before the baby's mainly sensory motor, just experiencing their world through their senses and through their movements, and starting to realize that like, okay, you're your own self and you're your own self moving through a world that has stable objects. It's like the beginning of this kind of next stage, this next like jump in operational thinking. So I'm just trying to kind of, I wasn't expecting you to follow all that with notes because I'm just kind of freestyling here, but I was just kind of randomly linked that to the Piaget idea, right? Because it's directly related. His idea that the kid goes through these levels of development. So as the child starts to understand themselves better, they also start to realize like, okay, this is me and that's you and that's you and that's you and that's you. And some of you are, boys, some of you are girls, some of you are taller than me and some of you are shorter than me and some of you are wearing a black sweater and some of you are wearing a green sweater and some of you are, wearing shoes and some of you are wearing sandals, and starting to put people in categories, categorical self, that the objective self, starting to realize that like, not only is there me and other people, but the other people are different too. And the toddler starts to understand that she or he is defined by various categories such as like gender or things like shyness. So like some of my friends are more shy than me and some of my friends are less shy than me. And we're not all the same amount of shy. There's differences, and that's noticeable to kids pretty young. It's one of the like that well, that's one variable, right? They get, as soon as they start to understand that they're their own person, they start to get better at understanding other people too. Self-understanding and other understanding go together. Right, and I say this weird, the child develops an initial self-awareness that delineates from the formation of the objective self by about the middle of the second year of life. That is what I mean, but basically just this idea that as the kid's developing the self-awareness, that actually is setting up this ability to categorize after. And by the end of that second year, a child can label themselves in a bunch of ways, right? They can tell you which of their cousins are boys or girls or taller or shorter or have the same color hair or different colors of hair. And they're getting better at those kind of noun descriptive, categorical ways of thinking, right? It's like they're starting to build their ability to have a more complicated view of the world. So I think you'll find this kind of interesting. This is looking at self-recognition, right? Like knowing that you're your own person. And how one way that they've done this really kind of interestingly, and I like this experiment because it's cool and it's creative and it's really kind of harmless on the child. It's completely harmless. What you do is you take a kid at different ages and you just put them in front of a mirror and you put a little bit of makeup on their nose. And what you want to see is, does the kid like go like this to wipe off the makeup? And the idea is that if the kid looks in the mirror and sees themselves and knows that they're seeing themselves and sees something that's not usually there, there's a natural tendency to wipe at it. But if the kid looks in the mirror and sees themselves but doesn't recognize it as themselves and doesn't recognize that therefore there's any problem with that, there's no reason why the child would wipe at that any more than anything else. So what you see in this chart is that, okay, how many kids actually wipe at their nose, and then how old are they? And you see that there's this like huge increase that jumps almost to 75% are doing it by the time they're 2 years old. So sorry, I know it must be a tiny bit frustrating. Sometimes I like will be in the vibe of the point I'm making and I'll like actually say the slide before, but just to give you this as like a better note, the second point there, as the infant's understanding of themselves advances, it's matched with this parallel progression in the baby's expression of emotion. So it's these ideas are kind of interesting that it all goes together. As the kid starts to know themselves better, they start to understand others better, they start to understand their emotions better, they start to get more control of their emotions, that these things are all interrelated. And so far we've said that what's the self? Well, the self, there's a part of that that's subjective, the part that like is aware that it's that you're your own person, and then there's a part of it that's categorical, or like how you're different than other people or similar to other people, and there's part of it that's emotional. The child starts to realize that like other people have their own emotions. So this the point I keep trying to make, sorry, and I'm not sure if I'm making it well, but this idea that the child's understanding of their own emotion and their own self and their understanding of others are sort of two sides of the same coin that co-develop. Right, you'd say it co-evolved throughout human history, but it's co-develops throughout a lifespan. Near the end of the first year, a baby usually starts to use their caregiver's emotions to guide their own feelings. Right, so I'm going to talk a little bit about this, right? Like the classic idea of the kid doing something funny and then like Charlotte doing something and then looking at me to see if I smile, and then if I smile, she finds it like super funny. Right? It's like confirmation. So I just wanted to show you this because even though that was kind of one study, there's been other people that have tried to look at this and have found similar things, right? Like you'll see these stats aren't the exact same, but you can kind of notice a pattern that shows that as the child's getting older and as they're like in the second part here, it says like late second year, early third year, which is a weird way to say around two. So around two, there's this emerging self-awareness that reflects a sense of like, this is me that I'm looking at. So you see that as soon as kids are like 3 months old, they're starting to like smile at a mirror. Do they recognize it's themselves? That's a tough question. And I'm sure some of you that are maybe your parents or have like young siblings or have just been around babies would argue that it seems like it's earlier that they notice themselves. And I can hear that argument because it does with my child too, but it's, again, it's curious. Yeah, for the class sake, I should do this experiment with Charlotte. See, I feel like yeah, because what would it have to mean if she didn't, right? Like, would she be looking at them in the mirror and recognizing me, but not herself? But it's like, or is she just like smiling at it? Because she's definitely like, and this kind of gets to this consciousness question, right? Self-consciousness. Like, there's a difference between looking at in the mirror and seeing yourself and looking in the mirror and seeing yourself and knowing that you're looking at you. That self-recognition component, that self-awareness, that reflective sense of me. And that autonomy, or that autonomy, that think of what autonomy means, right? Like control of self, that I'm my own thing, that I have autonomy. That autonomy builds as the infant's mental and motor abilities develop. So that sense of self is going to develop as the child starts to get smarter and more kind of physically capable as their motor abilities develop, like most specifically things like talking and walking. So an infant actually begins to develop this idea of like other people having their own internal mental states, that like some 2-year-olds, and especially like by the time the kid's like 2.5, 3, like they'd be able to understand that like right now dad's mad and mom's happy. Like they can understand that like not everybody experiences their emotion, and the idea is that that's like a place that they weren't always at, that an infant becomes aware, right? That even that word becomes aware implies that there was a point that they weren't. An infant becomes aware that other people have this separate intentions, right? You're doing something that could be for a different reason than me. You have your own reasons, your own, and obviously a child couldn't explain this, but you have your own motivations, your own desires, your own urges, your own defenses, all these things. You have a mind of your own. And that's one of the reasons that as a child starts to like become aware of that, and their ability to like play with each other changes. A child's capacity to pay attention to both another person's intention and an object at the same time, right? We're both playing with this toy dollhouse or whatever. We're both playing with it. We're playing together. This is a form of joint attention, like us both paying attention to things. It's like Charlotte grabbing a toy and bringing it over to me, and us looking at it, and us both like her pointing at things and me looking at what she's pointing and me pointing and her looking at that, and like that ability of us to pay attention to the same thing, joint attention. And we know that that's like so important with the development of all these other cognitive skills later, everything from, like it says there, language, just intellect in general, different behavioral aspects, different abilities to self-regulate, especially where I say emotional adjustment, right? The joint attention is related to all kinds of things. Okay. Because you could almost look at it like this, like joint attention is just a type of attention, right? So if being able to pay attention better would help you with things like writing or paying attention in class or whatever kind of personal cognitive things, it makes sense that being able to pay attention with someone else on the same thing better would make you better able to like play successfully, be a good athlete, teammate with someone, be good at work in the future with people. It's like that ability to kind of share a combined focus. It's interesting to see that in infants is related quite heavily to things like performance later, especially cognitively. Okay, so goodness of fit. Experience suggests that children differ from each other in early ways and early in life, and that obviously also parents differ. This is what this goodness of fit thing means, that there's also like not just are kids different, but kids are obviously born into different families. Right, so say a kid it gets really stressed out really easy and mom's really anxious to be making sure she's meeting all the needs and maybe being too overbearing, then that could be not a great goodness of fit. But say if the child really needed that extra stimulation, maybe that's a perfect fit. So goodness of fit means like sort of how good is the match between the needs of the baby and what mom's providing or what the caregiver's providing. What's the match between the child's temperament and what the situation that the child needs to deal with is. Like, does a child get stressed out easy and they're born into a family of 8 kids where the house is always busy? Or are they born into a family with as an only child? It's like those are obviously very different situations for somebody with the same starting point temperament. So this is where this goodness fit aspect comes in. Like, what's the fit between temperament and environment? Okay, ethology. I think ethology is super cool. It's sort of the study of like animal behavior and psychology and behavior and basically social organization, like how they act in groups and stuff, and how that has interesting things to say about humans. I have a totally different style definition here. Just the study, and you can have this. This is a better one in a way. Just the study of human behavior and social organization. So I'm just saying it in the opposite way. Basically looking at how humans behave and how humans organize society and how that has links to biology, right? Which is just another way of saying we're not the only mammals that live in social groups that have behavior that's influenced by things like emotions and desires and fears and stress, right? That these are things that we share with the animal kingdom. I'm not sure why I have the monkey hooking the dog, but it's like you look at that and you probably see friendship and caring, and it's very easy for you to see very human emotional variables, even just in that picture. Okay, and what we're going to talk about upcoming here is stuff around attachment and how attachment actually comes from the research of John Bowlby, who, and then one of his famously one of his students, Mary Ainsworth, and that research comes from ethology, right? John Bowlby's like a famous ethologist looking at this. He's one of the most famous in this field. So Bowlby comes up with this, and Ainsworth come up with this idea of attachment theory. I want to kind of hit all these points, like, and really stress that in that first point, right? You see that attachment. Okay, obviously there's a strong attachment between mom and baby. what Bowlby's saying is that that's actually a genetic characteristic of all human beings, that actually there's a genetic aspect to that relationship. We know there's like oxytocin and these bonding chemicals that are associated with pregnancy, and that increase in women before they're about to have the baby, and that even men that are around the mother a lot before the baby's born can show increases in these bonding chemicals. And this is all kind of talking about this idea that there's like this genetic aspect to it that's like deeply linked to our mammal past, that's like deeply genetic and biological. The view that this ability and this need to form an attachment relationship that the baby feels towards mom is a genetic characteristic that all human beings have. There's not some babies that are just born that don't need mom. And then so that's attachment theory in general. And then the idea is that, okay, well, we have to look at the relationship between mom towards baby and the relationship of baby towards mom. And when we're looking at how mom looks at baby, we're looking at that as like an emotional connection or emotional bond, an affectional bond, an emotional tie to the infant that the parent feels. Right? And there's a biochemical component of that. The mom's experiencing a lot of bonding, hormonal biochemistry that's bonding her with baby. And so my point here though is, so mom's forming this emotional tie with baby. Baby's completely attached to mom emotionally. Baby is months and months and months away from viewing themselves as their own person. They're so connected to mom at such a deep genetic level. This emotional emotional tie to a parent influenced by the infant. Right now, obviously, the connection from mom and baby, to say it's just emotional, right? Because there's not that cognitive component. Remember, the baby's not thinking like an adult does. The baby's in this sensory motor experience where they're being stimulated by all this visual information, all these sights. Mom is different than everyone else because mom's also feeding. Because in the reason I'm kind of not struggling, but like tripping a bit with this is like, what is emotional attachment without the ability to kind of think through what that emotional attachment is? It almost seems like a real argument for the biological nature of it, right? That it's like so deep in the child's unconscious or behavioral genetics that like, yeah, it's attachment. Attachment is just a stronger word than a bond. There's an emotional bond and an attachment. Okay, so I think I made that point and probably made it not as economically as I could have. I could have probably said that a lot faster, but again, I'm trying to contextualize this stuff. So then some children do develop something called the reactive attachment disorder, or where they can have real difficulty forming attachment for a variety of reasons that we'll chat about, and that can get in the way of the child developing social relationships later, right? That early difficulty establishing what you could call trust, and trust of what? Obviously, trust at this stage isn't like a thought out thing. Trust is my environment a threat or is it safe? And that then would get in the way of future relationships. Makes total sense. So you can see how it happens, but it's still a very difficult thing to have to try to work through, right? This appears to prevent a child from forming close social relationships, and then it's like, well, that's not just one thing, because then you have to ask the second question of like, what's the long-term negative effect of not being able to develop close social relationships? Now, the majority of parents are able to establish strong attachment relationships, right? It's like, I think the stats, depending on who you're looking at, it's anywhere between 60 to 70%. But it's important to look at kind of both sides of this, right? How it's experienced by mom or the primary caregiver. For this purposes, I'm just going to keep saying mom, because to keep saying Obviously, there's scenarios where mom's not raising the child, but for so each sentence isn't awkward, I'm going to keep saying mom. Obviously, there's scenarios where like a dad could be raising the baby, or where an adoptive parent, or maybe a grandmother. It's interesting because when I teach in developmental psych in person, a lot of times that's where a lot of questions come, right? Like a lot of people have really good questions, awesome questions about that. Like, well, I was raised by my grandma, and I had, and with my Kitchener students, we have awesome conversations, and so I just want to make it clear that even though I'm saying mom and baby, I obviously am well aware of the fact that there's a multitude of ways that people experience childhood. I'll try to kind of comment on it at times. Okay, so we're going to look at both sides of this. Say if you, for some reason, came to Kitchener and you're with your friends and you're going to go shopping. Say you went to Fairview Mall, probably the biggest mall in Kitchener, and say you're there, like, say it's Christmas shopping, and for whatever reason, I'm there with Charlotte, right? And Charlotte, by that time, will be, close to a year and a half. And let's say that we run into each other in the hall, and you're like, "Oh, hey, there's Mike," and you can tell it's Charlotte, and you're like, "Hey, Charlotte, what's up? How are you? What do you think about politics?" It's like you're obviously not going to talk to her like that. It's like you're going to be like, "Oh, hi, Charlotte, how are you?" And you're probably going to, like, if she's saying her stroller, you're probably going to like lean over a bit. You're probably going to like open up a little bit. You're probably going to be like, "Hey, how's it going? How are you?" And notice how, like, sounds weird when I do that, but what I'm literally doing is like extending out the vowels. I'm sort of teaching the child how to talk without even, whether I know if I'm doing it or not. And you'll see that I'm getting lower, I'm going higher pitch with my voice, I'm slowing down, I'm making eye contact, I'm softening my facial features, I'm getting bigger and softer looking, I'm probably literally ducking down to get closer and less intimidating. It's like this automatic style or pattern of interactive behaviors and vocal styles that I wouldn't have to like teach you. It's not like I'm going to be like, okay, well, if you ever meet my kid, like, it's important that you don't talk to them like an adult and like ask them political questions or whatever, right? It's like, you've seen a baby before, the babies, you say, "Oh, hi, how are you?" And you like, but my point is that it's sort of interesting. And it's like the people that do that better are less likely to provoke stranger anxiety in kids. They're more likely to form attachment relationships. It's like there's this idea that this is coming from both directions, and that there's this kind of like almost people without even having to be sort of taught have kind of just throughout their life picked up this idea of how to interact with kids. But again, people do it better than others. And the degree to that synchronicity or that sync between parent and child seems to be linked to cognitive development, right? It's like important to the child that the parent is engaging in ways that's engaging the child, or acting in ways that's engaging the child. This mutual interlocking pattern of behavior, right? The baby's like, mom's playing a game, and then the baby smiles, and that makes mom do it more, and then baby smiles, and then mom do it more, and then that's actually developing warm emotion. If every time mom did something that made the baby smile, mom then immediately like switch topics or something, it's like that'd be confusing to the baby. It's like it gets to this idea of a lot of this is this, I don't know, I'm just like dancing around. A lot of it is this sync, the sync between emotionally and behaviorally between mom and baby. This picture, my wife doesn't like this picture. This picture was taken the day that my first child was born, Evelyn. It's in front of the Kitchener Hospital. Fathers and mothers interact differently with infants, and kids benefit from both types of interaction, from both male and female interaction. And I'm going to talk about that a little bit more coming up, but it is interesting to note, right? Because oftentimes people are like, well, what if there's situations where there's only one parent, or if it's not a heterosexual couple, or what if there's different scenarios where the child's being raised? And I think the point still is valid that a child benefits from both types of influences. And if it's not present, then it's important to seek that out in other additional ways. One tough part about like doing this class asynchronous or whatever the word is that is not being able to kind of take live questions, because sometimes that kind of brings us to interesting places. But I obviously know that there's different types of families and everything, but the literature is pretty clear that children benefit, that although there's differences in, obviously not all dads and moms interact with kids the same way, that if you were to look at thousands and thousands of dads compared to thousands and thousands of moms, there's differences in how they interact with kids that are more than just random. There's absolute patterns. Not absolute patterns. There's absolutely patterns is what I meant to say. And children benefit from both. And I'll kind of talk about that. Okay, but actually, sorry, I kind of gave you a faulty segue there, because I forgot that I'm going to talk more about differences in mother and father parenting styles in an upcoming presentation. I think chapter 6. I want to make this point, right? An infant's attachment to their parent. This idea of whether, and you'll hear this language of like a secure attachment, and I want you to, when you hear that word secure, to think of the word security, right? And it's almost like so simple, right? Obviously, like the word secure and security are together, but we don't often think about that, okay, a secure attachment really means that mom represents safety, and mom represents the ability to calm me down when I'm overwhelmed. And if mom doesn't represent that, then the world's a scarier place. And the child's developing this internal model, right? Think of what a model is. It's not the actual thing. It's a representation of the thing. It's a representation of a plane, if it's a model plane. So the child's building this model of what relationship is, right? It's like, how available is mom? And so this is saying, like, where does it come from? Well, it comes from the child's confidence that mom's available, that mom will provide what the child needs and not rebuff, right? So that the expectation that when I need mom, she's going to be there, and she's going to be there in a way that's going to help me with what I need help with, and that's able to allow me to use mom as a safe base. And that's really deeply stamped in the child's mind by the time about 4 or 5, right? And then why does that matter? Well, it matters because, well, then the child's getting ready to start entering this another huge social developmental stage of going to school, right? And they're going to start to be influenced by peers and all these other people. And then that internal model of what is a relationship? How do I act around other people? Am I valuable? What should I expect? All these kind of things are like, that model then gets imposed on all these new relationships. That's sort of the idea. That the internal model becomes elaborated from the time a child's 1 till about 3 or 4. 4 or 5. Right? Who they think they are, what they think relationship is. Do they trust? Do they think that it's almost like if you're designing a computer, it's a weird way of saying it, but I've said it I think already in this presentation, it's like the operating system that they're then going to process their future relationships using. And that's why from a psychoanalytic perspective, these early years of life are so important and so deeply important and key in establishing this sense of who the child is, which is important because then that gets played out in all their emotional and behavioral experiences. So I would show you the classic video, but last year I had it in the presentation, and then YouTube was like, it was like a violation or whatever, so I had to like take it out. It was a big pain, but I can kind of verbally explain it, because in the strange situation, what Ainsworth does is she basically makes a scenario where there's a room with some toys in it, and the mom goes in with the baby, and they play for a bit, and then the interviewer knocks on the door, and mom leaves, and the baby's kind of like, what's going on, and starts to cry and gets upset. And then after a minute or so, mom comes back in the room. And what you want to watch is, okay, now baby was upset because she was by herself. Is she able to, now mom's back, is she able to have mom pick her up and calm her down? And is she able to use mom as a security and then go back to playing? And you'd say, okay, say mom comes in, picks up the baby calms back down, goes back to playing. You'd say that's a secure attachment. The baby was able to use mom to calm back down. The baby's able to use mom as a secure base. You'll sometimes, and if you want to watch this, if you wanted to even just pause, because again, I got like a strike or whatever last time I used the video, so I'm not going to do it again. But like, if you just were to open another window and go on YouTube and watch a strange situation experiment, and you'll see this experiment, right? And then you'll see that you'll be able to actually see a child demonstrating these. Then with the insecure avoidant, the same experiment, but this time when the mom comes in, the baby, she picks up the baby to try to calm the baby down, but the baby's like leaning back, not looking at mom, avoiding eye contact, like she's avoiding the mother. And you have to remember, she was crying because mom wasn't there, but then mom comes back and she's avoiding that ability to use mom as security, right? Usually because there's either been, mom's been too stimulating or not stimulating enough. And so the baby's response to that is the avoidance. And then in other situations, the baby might not also be able to use mom as a security, and will actually, when mom picks her up, she'll actually then maybe offers her a toy and the baby like knocks it away. Again, I would strongly recommend pausing this, watching that strange situation video, and all this will make sense because I'm kind of talking about the video. They show the mom picking up the baby, goes to offer it a toy, the baby hits it away, goes to calm it down with patting it back, the baby hits the hand away. It's like the baby's resisting. Right? Usually in situations where mom's been really inconsistent, and then the baby doesn't know, like, do I trust this? And is like resisting using that. Resisting what? Avoiding what? They're resisting and avoiding using mom as a source of security to calm back down and then sort of bravely go back into the world. Right? The secure baby was able to still be upset, but mom comes back. Okay, mom calms me down. Now I go back to playing. The insecure babies aren't able to use mom as that calm back down, that security to deal with their emotional upsetness, to soothe. And then some kids, and these are the most negative situations, usually around things like abuse or neglect, some kids can develop disorganized responses, right? Like not knowing how to react to mom. And again, this would be in in sad situations where maybe the baby's been either exposed to violence towards mom or towards itself, or been exposed to a lot of neglect. And then you could see how in those scenarios, this is like the person that loves me and is treating me this way. It's like you could see how that could develop a disorganized view of what a relationship or trust is. Okay. So where do these attachments come, or where does the origins of this come from, right? The origins of how secure, insecure an attachment is between the mom and the baby. And I want you to note this first point, right? How available is mom emotionally, or how available is the primary caregiver emotionally? Notice how that doesn't just say physically. It's that mom's available and emotionally available. And that is, mom is responding, her responsiveness is in a way that's contingent. Contingent means, okay, if you come into my restaurant, that's a weird example, and you say, can I have a glass of milk? And I'm like, yeah, sure, here's your glass of orange juice. And then the person beside you is like, can I have a glass of apple juice? I'm like, yeah, sure, here's your root beer. It's like, I'm not giving you drinks contingent on what you ordered. It's like I should be giving you, what I give you should be based on what you ordered. Another way you could say that is, what I give you should be contingent on what you ordered. So contingent responsiveness means the baby's crying and needs to be changed, and mom changes her. She doesn't try to calm her back down and go to sleep. It's like the baby needs. So is mom responding to that need right? Or maybe the baby needs to be fed and you're trying to change the baby again, and why won't this baby go to sleep? And you're trying to, it's diapers, like, it's usually one of those things. It's like, how much is mom responding in a way that is responsive to what the baby needs? How sensitive is mom to the cues of the child? And just the fancy way of saying that is contingent responsiveness, right? A contingency just means there's different ways that she could respond, and does she pick the one that makes sense for what the baby needs in the moment? And that's because then you got to think about it, right? Because we're asking, like, how does the baby learn to trust mom? If this is almost like pre-thought, well, the baby's really trusting the pattern of mom's behavior. It's like, does mom seem to be emotionally available when I need it, and is she available in a way that's actually addressing what the situation is asking for? Because you could see how if the baby was starving or really hungry and mom's trying to keep rocking her to sleep, that would be stressful for the baby. Mom's here, mom's emotionally available, but she's not doing the thing that I'm asking for. Again, this is hard to talk about because we're trying to talk about a baby that's still very much pre that level of thought. So I would just shout out again, and I know I've said this a couple times, but I think it would be worth your while to just quickly YouTube search that strange situation experiment, and even just, I think it's like a 7-minute video. You can fast forward the first couple minutes where they talk about it. I just want you to see the actual footage where they actually show the mom going in and out of the room. Maybe I'll link it below this video in the description. Find the link in the description. It sounds like I'm actually a YouTuber. But I could do that. I could start putting links in the description, I guess, if there's things I'm referencing. I just need to remember to do it. Okay, so I was saying that's where secure attachments come from, but then I would like you to have these points too, that the avoidant, and I sort of verbally said this, but avoidant attachment is more common when, this is like the Goldilocks principle, right? When it's like not the bowl's too warm or not too cold or too warm, but just right. It's like, that's one of the hard things about parenting is sometimes too much stimulation of the child's not good and too little is not good, and it's not always obvious what the right amount is. And I was kind of making the point before that the good kind of rule is, or not rule, but just guideline would be to think that within that first year the child's not manipulating, right? Within that first year it's basically going to always be feed me, change me, soothe me, or hold me, like rock. I did the baby bounce. It's weird now, I'll be even standing in the bank in line or whatever, and I'm like, got a little bit of a bounce in how I stand, just because I'm like so used to, for the last like year, just constantly having that like little bounce. It's amazing how much that little bounce helps babies go to sleep though. So anyways, I got way off point there. That avoidant is then usually, I was going with the Goldilocks idea, but that avoidant is usually in scenarios where the caregiver is either like way too overbearing or neglectful. And then resistant is more when it's inconsistent, right? Sometimes mom's like there and doing great, and sometimes mom's not there, and that's actually really hard on the baby because the baby doesn't know what to expect. And when it doesn't know what to expect, it's resisting trusting that, right? It's if sometimes this helped you and sometimes it left you without help, you would be resistant to trusting it. It actually makes sense. And then the disorganized or disoriented, you can see how in scenarios where there's abuse or where a parent's being abused in front of the child, it could confuse the idea of what love and relationship is. That's a very tough one. Right, so the stats are, and you'll find it different places, but it's something like in the 70s, 60s to 70s is a secure attachment, and then the majority of, so it's basically just secure, insecure, and then within secure there's 3 types of insecure, and avoidance the most common. And then in situations where it's more neglectful, then sometimes you get the resistant and more specifically disorganized in the worse, in the I don't know, most challenging situations, I guess. Okay, so a couple more points here about attachment. Significant changes in relationships can affect attachment patterns, right? So like, well, the most obvious one would be like towards the negative, like if there's divorce in the family and then the child seeing the parent much less, that could affect the attachment pattern. So this is kind of like saying it's not like just as soon as like, okay, now the child's like 1.5, they have a secure attachment, that means I'm like, my job's done as a parent. No, it's like obviously people don't think like that, but the idea would be that's a really important initial step, and then everything that comes later still matters too. But Bowlby suggests that and I kind of already mentioned this earlier, but by the time the child's 4 or 5, they've internalized this attachment pattern. And why that matters is because that then becomes the model that they impose on other relationships, like with their teachers and peers and, people out in the real world, people outside the family. So it's almost like the model of what relationship is that includes both an understanding of self and others is developed within this child's mind by the time they're like 4 or 5, and then they take that and play it out in the world, basically, when they go to school. Okay. So I want to look at this for sex, because now we're saying, okay, so kids are different in their attachment, and you can score that, and you wouldn't really score it in that sense. You would classify kids as different attachment styles, right? You use the word classify because there's much fewer categories you're putting it in. You're not really scoring them on a scorecard. You're watching behaviors, and you'd be looking for signs that are significant of, that pattern. Primarily in that experiment, you're looking if baby's able to use mom to calm back down. So kids that are and that score high in attachment, it's interesting because when you look at how things play out a bit later, it's like they tend to be more sociable, more positive in their behavior towards their siblings and towards friends. They tend to be less clingy on things like on things like teachers, tend to be less aggressive and disruptive at school, tend to be more empathic and emotionally mature at school and outside of the home in other settings. Right, so basically just this idea that like secure attachments seem to be related to a positive butterfly effect in terms of social understanding of self and other, and that seems to have this butterfly ripple effect on your kind of whole social relational world. So there's sort of 4 phases of attachments, or of attachment, the process. 4 phases of how it happens. If you look at it over the time in the child's life, that in this first phase, sort of from birth to roughly 2 months, the infant's directing their attention to human figures, right? If the kid's in a room, they're more interested in the humans in the room than in random objects. They're really focused on humans, especially human faces. A stranger or a sibling or a parent are equally as likely to get a child that's under 2 months to smile or cry. Now, there's some differences when it's specifically mom. It's basically mom and everybody else to the baby. By phase 2, 2 to 7 months, and obviously there's a huge range right there, because obviously there's like a baby that's 2 months and a month, 2 months and a week old versus a baby that's almost 7 months. That's a pretty big difference. But during that time period, you see the child start to attach to one figure, usually the primary caregiver, usually mom. The baby starts to distinguish as they get closer to 7 months. You've heard me say this a few times now. By the time they're getting close to 7 months, their vision's getting strong, right? They're halfway to adult vision. They're starting to be able to tell really well between, and their memory's developing, so they're being able to remember too who they've seen before and who they haven't, which is what familiar and unfamiliar means. Phase 3, from 7 months to 2 years, these specific attachments develop, right, with these increased local motor skills. So then the baby starts to crawl to seek out mom and starts to like behave in ways that are seeking additional contact with the attachment figure. By the time the child gets to 24 months or 2 years, the child starts to become aware of other people's feelings, other people's goals, other people's plans, starts to take those into account with their own actions. Mom likes when I do this, I'll do this, because mom likes that. So notice how that's taking what mom likes into account. It's like that's a level of thought that the child didn't have before. Okay. So, developmental cascades. How awesome is that picture? I love that picture. That picture isn't related except just that I wanted to use it to represent this word cascades, right? You'd say that's like a cascading fall, or a cascading, yeah, falls, like, you call it like Niagara Falls. That's a cascading falls, or a river that just keeps falling down a bit, then a bit, then a bit, then a bit, right? But usually with development, we'd be looking at this as the direction of going up, that this development goes up, but it goes up on all these different levels at all these different times. And some of these developments are biological, and some are cognitive, and some are social emotional, right? And they're all influenced by social context and the culture you're in, and the parenting all influence these attachment related issues, right? The cultural and parenting influences on attachment are abound, meaning there's just lots. We're complicated creatures, that's for sure. So I thought you'd find this pretty interesting too, this idea of like looking at family as, so constellation, meaning like you see like the constellations of the stars, like the Big Dipper, right? What the constellation means, like a collection of stars, like a family's actually a collection of subsystems. So if you look at my family, there's like the relationship between me and my wife, but then there's also the relationship between me and Evie, and the relationship between me and Charlotte, and the relationship between me, Charlotte, and Evie, like me and the girls, and then the relationship between Mom, Charlotte, and Evie, Julie, and Charlotte and Evie, and then the relationship between Julie and Evie, and Julie and Charlotte, and the relationship between Charlotte and Evie. And there's all these like relationship, and then there's like how my relationship with my wife influences Charlotte, and how my relationship with my wife influences Evie, and this idea of like, all these arrows going both ways. These all influence, all these subsystems within the family are influencing each other. They have reciprocal influences, back and forth influences. So reciprocal association, so I just use the word reciprocal, meaning like back and forth, right? So like, sorry, I keep hitting the mic, but like right now it's not reciprocal, I'm just talking to you. But if I was in North Bay and I was talking and you were asking questions and we're going back and forth, you'd say that's reciprocal, right? Back and forth. And it's this idea that obviously parenting, or parents shape a baby, but the baby also shapes parents. The direction of socialization, or how it, like, you socialize the baby to the world, but the baby also in some ways, by the demands that they place on you, socialize you into being a parent. It's this socialization, or this learning of social roles, is bi-directional. Children socialize parents just as parents socialize children. Of course the baby doesn't know it's doing it. Right, so one thing is that sometimes having kids can drive people apart, and sometimes it can drive people together, and it very rarely has a completely neutral effect. Oftentimes when it's in a positive way though, couples and like I know for myself, it's like it's almost impossible to think of myself other than as a dad. And in a lot of ways, viewing myself as a dad is like one of the most positive ways I view myself. And it's like such a huge way of how I see myself in my life and what's meaningful and what matters. And I think I could say that it's given me and Julie a more like kind of stable identity as a couple. I think that's fair to say. It's not easy. It's far from easy. I've been married almost 10 years now. It's like there's a lot of good days and there's struggles too, right? And it's like, and same with parenting, but don't tell my wife. Every day is always good. No, I'm just joking. It's like we all have, if we're all being honest, it's like nothing's perfect, but if you can get with someone that like values you and you value them and there's respect and all this stuff, and it's like, then when you have kids, it can cement that a lot and really kind of stabilize the family. Or it can do the opposite, right? And that's kind of the point here. It can have both kinds of effects. So this is a picture of me and my oldest when she was about two, at the Butterfly Conservatory. Look at how cool your teacher is. This idea of scaffolding comes up a lot when you're talking about teaching kids, right? That you're kind of displaying a role modeling, or that you're teaching through showing and parents time interactions, so that oftentimes that the infant has experiences with both parents. And this is kind of what I was getting at before, that when you look at how mothers tend to interact with babies, it tends to be more focused on childcare activities, like especially early on. And it makes sense, right? Some of it's biological, right? Like mom's like feeding the baby a lot, and especially around feeding. And then when you look at how dads tend to play with kids, it tends to be more around things like rough and tumble play. And actually kids that don't get exposed to rough and tumble play, we'll talk about this later in the course more, but tend to experience lots of issues around anxiety later in life, because rough and tumble play sort of teaches you what's allowed, what's not allowed, it teaches you a lot about kind of physicality and it teaches you how to play. It's just an important part of development, and people there's costs of not having that. Okay, so this wraps it up for today. So I just have a couple of reflection points here. Oops. All right, the final 8 points. Number one, emotion is these are summary points, right? Emotion is a feeling or effect that occurs when a person's in a state or an interaction that's important to them. Infants display a number of emotions earlier in their development, such as crying, smiling, showing fear, to fear that the infant develops, or stranger anxiety, and a fear of separation from the caregiver, separation anxiety sometimes called. As infants develop, it's important for them to increase their ability to regulate their own emotions, self-regulation. Temperament is an individual's behavioral style and characteristic way of responding emotionally. Chess and Thomas classify infants as easy, difficult, or slow to warm. Kagan proposed that inhibition to the unfamiliar is an important temperamental category. Roberth and Bates emphasized that effortful control, self-regulation, is an important temperamental dimension. I don't think I have Rothbard and Bates' names on that actual slide, but we talked about that point. Goodness of fit can be an important aspect of the child's development also. Erickson argued that an infant's first year is characterized by the stage of trust versus mistrust. Independence becomes a central theme in the second year of life, or autonomy, which is characterized by that last slide was missing a word, which is characterized by the stage of autonomy. Number 4, the strained situation is a useful tool for examining attachment. Infants differ in how they react to their caregivers leaving and then re-entering the room. Infants show a strong interest in the social world and are motivated to understand it. Infants are more socially sophisticated and insightful at an earlier age than we previously thought. That's interesting to keep in mind. Number 6, it's just a couple more. Attachment is a close emotional bond between two people, in between mother and baby specifically. In infancy, contact, comfort, and trust are important in the development of attachment. Securely attached babies use the caregiver, usually the mother, as a secure base from which to explore their environment. There's 3 types of insecure attachment that we regularly speak about: avoidant, resistant, and disorganized. Caregivers of securely attached babies are more sensitive to the baby's signals, more constantly available to meet the need. Number 7, the transition to parenthood requires considerable adaptation and adjustment on the part of parents. Children socialize parents just as much as parents socialize children. Parents use a wide range of methods to manage and guide infants' behavior. In general, mothers spend more time in caregiving than fathers do. Again, this isn't a moral argument for if they should or not. This is just from observational data. Fathers tend to engage more in physical, playful interaction with infants. The quality of child care is uneven, and this remains a controversial topic. So it's kind of almost doesn't need to be said that obviously some people do a better and worse job at parenting. And it doesn't necessarily have to do with things like income and resources, right? That there's a lot of quality care given at all, I say they're kind of at all social economic levels, just kind of making the point that I don't mean that like some kids have more stuff, right? That some environments are emotionally and intellectually more stimulating. And resources matter too for the child to develop, especially things like nutrition. All right, that wraps it up. That's the end of chapter 4. Thanks for watching. I know this is kind of long. This is going to ring in at about 2 hours and 15 minutes. I hope this video is a little bit cleaner, like in terms of audio and stuff. And also, I'll be coming with more later this week about the next assignment. All right, take care. And thanks for watching. See you soon.